with Jim DiEugenio. He's the author of The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, and the publisher of KennedysandKing.com. He's written a 4-part article on the Kennedys and civil rights, and he also gives a full background going all the way back to the post-Civil War Reconstruction. So it's a fascinating deep dive into the topic, and very timely today as we see an increasingly aggressive white supremacist movement and anti-democratic actions taken by state governments, such as voter suppression. This is all starting to make the news again. So, Jim, thanks for writing this article and thanks for speaking today.
Sure, David, my pleasure.
Let's get into it. I mean, you start with part 1, The Rebel Yell Will Rise Again, you called it, and you start going into how the Kennedy administration, how they found themselves where they were in 1961, and you go all the way back practically 100 years.
See, the reason I decided to go ahead and start there is because if you don't have that background to Kennedy's inauguration, then you don't really know what a terrible situation he was caught in. Because what happened in the South was that through a process of presidents not doing anything about it, and the Supreme Court ratifying what we call the Redeemer Movement wanted to do, which was to nullify the Reconstruction Acts and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which they did. All right. What happened is that in the South, you had, if not as bad as what existed before the Civil War, it was almost as bad as what happened before the Civil War. Okay, the former freedmen weren't quite slaves, but they were almost all, servants, sharecroppers, etc. They lived in segregated, terrible conditions. All right, they didn't go to the same schools. They couldn't sit in the same areas of restaurants. They couldn't even drink out of the same water fountains. All right, and that was all done. That was all done in a relatively short period of time, from about 1876 to about 1896. And the horrible part about that is that a large part of what was done by the Republicans, by overthrowing the things that Lincoln stood for. All right? And so let me go ahead and explain that, okay? Because so many people on the right try and screw this thing up, historically speaking. All right, this is how it happened. In the Reconstruction era, which lasted approximately 11 years, all right, 1865 to 1876, there were laws passed, and plus the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were supposed to go ahead and prevent the power elite in the South from subjugating the former slaves, now called freedmen. And what they did is, it was supposed to give them the right to vote. They couldn't be discriminated against. That's the 14th Amendment. And they were supposed to have citizenship rights, the 15th Amendment. Now, the problem with this is that once Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner died, okay, which was by about 1874, see, they were the real firebrands of the radical Republican segment of the party. And once Lincoln was assassinated, there was never enough men in the South. There was anywhere from 15 to 20,000 troops in the South. That was never enough men to cover the vast expanse of, say, for example, Texas or Louisiana. All right? And what needed to have been done and was not done, this was a terrible mistake, because the Republicans had so many problems with Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated. What should have been done is that the great plantations should have been subdivided and parceled out to the slaves who had worked on them. Okay? And that would have done 2 or 3 things right off the bat. Number one, okay, it would have struck a blow, a permanent blow, against the upper class system in the South. That would have been very important. Okay? All right, number 2, it would have given the former slaves a way of owning their own land and making their own money. Okay, see, sharecropping, they were always in debt with that system. All right, because in that system, the owner of the land rented out the property, advanced a certain amount of money for things like seed and tools, and then you had to pay it back when the crop came in. So it was very difficult for any of those sharecroppers to buy their own land. See, this way they would have had their own land. And number 3, it would have been a way of upward social mobility for future generations. Okay? They could have, with the money they made, they could have moved out. They could have sent their kids to college, that kind of thing. But see, that contrary to popular belief, that never happened in the South. There were only very, 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 very small areas where that happened. I think like in the islands off the coast of South Carolina.
It's fascinating because it sort of mirrors even what we saw in the early Cold War, where some of the things Kennedy was, trying to hash out in the Third World. It's kind of land reform. It's people who have been repressed by these oligarchies. You can kind of draw the line straight up into almost what Kennedy was dealing with directly in the Third World.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. So that didn't happen. And so what happened was, of course, is that the power elite in the South generally stayed intact. All right. Now, if you had that, plus, like I said, you never had a big enough army in the South to really occupy the territory. In my opinion, the number of troops in the South should have been at least 3 times as many as they put there. Like 15 to 20,000. There should have been at least 45 to 60,000 troops in the South. And that was the only way you could have occupied the territory. And in other words, with that kind of numbers of troops, you could have, built forts and had garrisons throughout the very bad, the worst states, in my opinion, from my study, were Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Okay? In those states, you had the rise of these various terrorist groups. It wasn't all the Klan. Okay, there was something called the White Line, the White League, the Red Shirts, etc. And the fact that you didn't have a strong enough force or a big enough force in the South allowed them to organize. All right? And then, of course, the body blow to all this was the election of 1876, which the Republicans made a deal with the Democrats that they would let the Army leave the last southern states if they would get Rutherford B. Hayes, their guy, in the White House. And plus, Hayes had the promise that he would not send the Army back in. And of course, that was a very clear signal that Reconstruction was over. The radical Republicans are no more. We are no longer the party of Lincoln. All right? And so when that happened, you essentially had a free-for-all. Those powerful organizations that I just mentioned now really didn't have anything much to worry about. Okay, in the way of there would not be any retribution for anything they did, and there really wasn't. All right, and so, and finally, the other point I try and make here.
Let me ask you one question. When you talk about the Redeemer movement a lot. Is that encompass all of these groups that you just
Yes,
talked about?
yeah, the general historical term that involves all these groups is called the Redeemer movement. In other words, and the reason that that's the term is that they were going to redeem the South after Reconstruction. Okay? They were going to restore the South to what it was. And in large part, they did.
Hmm.
Okay? All right. Now, it was made up of a lot of different terrorist groups, all right, which I mentioned before. Okay? But the overall movement was called the Redeemer movement. All right? Now, what made it even worse, as I was saying, is if you take a look at the presidency after Lincoln, I believe, if I remember correctly, out of the next 5 presidents, 4 of them were Republicans. Okay, it's not broken up until Grover Cleveland becomes president in the 1890s. Well, after the Civil War and into the 1870s, as the radical Republican Party was declining, the Republican Party now began to become the party of big business. All right? And what happened was they were strongly influenced by the philosophy of Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, no relation to Senator. The idea of what we call today the common term given it to it is social Darwinism. All right, that somehow wealthy people are wealthy because they deserve to be. And of course, the corollary is that poor people are poor because they deserve to be. And so they began to sanction the expansion of big business, which of course would end up with the Gilded Age, you know, with the giant fortunes of people like Rockefeller and Morgan. So they made a series of decisions in which somehow, and to this day I don't understand how they linked it together, that somehow big business in the North was equivalent to the plantation owners in the South. And so the decision, and I named 4 of them here in my essay, okay, at kennedysandking.com. In part 1, I named 4 of the decisions. And what these decisions did, all right, in a truly incredible way, and you really wonder if it was all a coincidence, all right, is that they more or less neutralized the Reconstruction Acts and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And it started fairly early, like in 1876. The 2 decisions that year were U.S. versus Cruikshank and U.S. versus Reese. Now, what those 2 decisions did is, number one, the first one, U.S. versus Cruikshank, essentially let the guilty parties go for the Colfax Massacre. All right? The Colfax Massacre was an unbelievably mind-bending slaughter of former freedmen. The latest estimates I've seen that they have, you know, because these things are so covered up, it takes them literally decades to get at the truth, where 105 freedmen were killed, all right, after they surrendered. And it's like you said earlier about these voting disputes we're having today, for example, in Florida and Arizona, that's what this was about. The Colfax Massacre that's what it was about. The freedmen were trying to not have the election rigged, which they felt the other side was doing. And it ended up in a big shooting, a shooting battle, all right? And after the freedmen surrendered, they were slaughtered anyway. So the Cruikshank decision essentially let the perpetrators go free, all right, on the basis that unlike what the 14th Amendment said, that there's equal protection under the law, the decision now was that only applied to state actions, not to those taken by individual citizens.
Hmm.
If you can believe that, I mean, that's a real mind bender, isn't it?
Right.
In other words, if the Klan or the White Line or the White League or any of those terrorist organizations was going to harass, injure, or kill anybody, the state would have to bring them to justice. Something that with the Union Army now gone, that was not going to happen. Okay? Or it would be very rare if it did. Okay?
Right.
Now, the other case I name is the U.S. versus Reese case. That happened the same year, and the Reese case had a parallel impact as the Cruikshank did on terrorism and criminality. The Reese case had a parallel impact on voting, because the Reese case was about a former slave trying to exercise his right to vote, but he was denied due to his alleged failure to pay a tax. The Supreme Court upheld the decision against the plaintiff. And that, of course, went a long way to neutralizing the 15th Amendment, which made former slaves citizens. Now, with that case on the books, it paved the way for all these artificial barriers that the South would now put up to obstruct former slaves from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, reading the Constitution under all that stuff. That's how all that stuff came in.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two really did a lot to sanction the power of the old power structure and their terrorist arms. Okay, some of those groups I mentioned. And so what you had, and I really felt that I had to name these things because you don't see them in history books. So in the essay, I went ahead and I named some of these horrible massacres, and I provided links to them. The Opelousas Massacre, I think that was in Louisiana. The Meridian Race Riot, that was in Mississippi. The Colfax Massacre, that was in Louisiana. The Battle of Liberty Place, that was in that one, and I have a picture of it here. That one actually took place on the main street of New Orleans, on Canal Street. Okay? I mean, that one is, you actually had the White Line group organized 5,000 armed men to get rid of the governor. Okay? Pitched battle against the police forces, which were outnumbered. The White Line movement won. They removed the governor. President Grant had to send in the army. Okay, that's how bad it was. And then the Hamburg Massacre of 1876, that's another one, all right? And that one was in South Carolina, okay? So those were some of the horrible things that took place around this time, okay, because they could not maintain any order. The Battle of Liberty Place, like I said, was about the replacement of the governor.
Right.
The Meridian Race Riot, that was about replacing the mayor. And in that one, they actually did. They shot a judge, terrorized the courtroom, went to the mayor's home, told him to pack up, drove him to the railroad station, and bought him a one-way ticket to New York. That's how. You see, and the thing is, I got to tell you, David, studying this thing as I did, and it took me about 3 months to write this thing. Do you know who Iris Chang was?
No, I don't.
Iris Chang was the author of a book about the rape. I think it's called The Rape of Nanjing.
Ah, okay.
That was the Japanese atrocities on the China mainland during World War II. And it literally made her mentally ill. And she eventually committed suicide, learning about all this horrible stuff. Okay?
Hmm.
And I'll tell you, reading about this stuff, and I'll explain later why most people don't know about it, because there was a cover-up about it. Okay? It's really enough to make you sick. And the thing is, you try and understand, and the only way you can understand it is that because these people in the South were born into this state of slavery, grew up with it, to them it was like a natural state of things. They actually thought that African Americans were not people, or they did not deserve to have any rights. Okay? And, and that's the only way I can explain this. These terrible, horrible things that they did.
Right.
But they really, really were horrifying. And
Yeah.
of course, we know, of course, that they do have some parallels today. Okay.
Well, right. I mean, it's kind of coups in all these different states. There's terrorism. These are obviously death squads operating. I mean, you don't have to go too far back in history to see almost this exact same thing playing out in, say, Central America or parts of Asia or a lot of places where the United States was helping to fund similar things or supporting it directly. So it's an interesting.
Also what they're doing in the American South with voter suppression.
Right.
Okay, that's all aimed at black people and poor people.
Right.
The Republican Party that's been what they're about. Okay, and it goes back to this. Except back then there was no order at all. There was no order at all, so they could just kill these people if they wanted, which they did. And I describe the one in Hinds County, where there was supposed to be a debate between the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay? But then the White Line group came in, and they started shooting people, And this battle went on for several days. All right? It was supposed to be a civil debate. Was not a civil debate. All right? And so the aim of all this was what they called the Mississippi Plan. After you had intimidated the voting populace so that African Americans would be afraid to register to vote and their white sympathizers would be intimidated against standing up for them, on the eve of an election, the Redeemers would go ahead and dress up in some kind of a costume to cover their identities. They would be armed with rifles and handguns so you could see them. They would get on their horses and they would go ahead and parade through the center of town with torches. And now tell me that doesn't sound like Hitler in about 1932.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so have you ever watched those torchlight parades in Berlin? Okay. Well, the message, of course, was that there is no civil order. And if you guys try and vote, you're going to be shot. Okay, so it's better to stay home. And, of course, that had a terrific impact. I think most people know that from about 1865 to about 1876, there were something like 16 or 17 black Americans who went to Washington as senators or congressmen. All right? All right, and there were literally scores of them who got voted into state and local offices. But after what the Redeemers accomplished, okay, by terror, then the African American vote in some counties in Mississippi, nobody was registered. Whereas they were many, many, many registered, upwards of like 75 to 80, 90% in some places. Okay. All right. And it was a good county in which you had 25% of black Americans who were registered. Okay. That was a really good place. All right. That's how bad it was. But of course, what happened after this is that was no more. That was no more. They even had something called the white primary. where African Americans weren't even allowed to run.
Mm.
Okay? And that was all part of those two decisions that I talked about. The Reese and Cruikshank decision by the Supreme Court, which of course was mainly Republicans at that time. All right? All right. So what happened is that the whole idea of Reconstruction was essentially overthrown by these Supreme Court decisions and by the fact that no president, the only one who really did anything about it, and this was not nearly enough or as often, was Ulysses S. Grant. Okay? Now, let me name the last two decisions by this Republican Supreme Court that essentially put the cap on it, that there was not going to be any question about who was running the South. Okay, after this. There was one called in 1883, the civil rights cases, in which the Supreme Court went ahead and put together, I think, 5 different cases. All right? And they all concerned discrimination in public accommodations. So we had one on criminal law, we had one in voting rights. This one would be discrimination in public accommodations. All right. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was supposed to have outlawed that. All right. But again, when they began to be discriminated against in the South, the Supreme Court sided with the defendants. Okay. Even though the Civil Rights Act was grounded on the 13th and 14th Amendments. All right. The opinion in this case was written by, I don't know why Grant ever appointed this guy. I think it was Grant. A former corporation railroad lawyer, Joseph Bradley. His contention was that discrimination did not necessarily translate into a form of subjugation. Okay? Now, to me, that's really kind of bizarre. Also, that Congress did not have the power to nullify private discrimination or overrule a state if it chose to ignore a private or local law.
Mm.
All right? Now, this is what he wrote. Quote, individual invasion of individual rights is not the subject matter of the amendment, unquote. Do you believe this stuff? But see, I drew a parallel at the beginning. See, this is the kind of thing you get with these kind of judges who I parallel with the Federalist Society today. You know, people like, you know, Kavanaugh and Scalia and those kind of, and Rehnquist, you know.
Right.
Now, if the 13th and 14th Amendment was not aimed at individuals, who was it aimed at? Well, we're going to learn that in a minute. But, of course, the coup de grace in all this was Plessy versus Ferguson, okay, 1896, what I think everybody's familiar with. That's the one that said that the freedmen did not have the right to travel in the same facilities as everybody else, okay? In other words, just because you were separated from the white Americans did not mean that your facilities were worse than white Americans. Okay? How about this one? Listen to this one. Quote, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. Unquote. Now, if that's not racist, I don't know what the heck is. Okay?
Right.
But that's what the court said, you know. And so what happened, of course, is that the Republican Party, there's a very good book on this by a guy named Lawrence Goldstone, and it's called Inherently Unequal. That's where I got most of this stuff. All right. And it's only about 200 pages, but it's a very good book. See, as the Republican Party was tracking towards big business, okay, their justices on the Supreme Court were diminishing the 14th Amendment's effectiveness to maintain rights for the freedmen, which was its original intent. That was the original intent of those amendments and those laws, while it's expanding those amendments for the purposes of corporations, which had nothing to do with their original intent.
You know, you kind of mentioned how the same Supreme Court justices managed to turn the 14th Amendment from something that was protecting individuals' rights into something that was protecting corporate rights. Do you want to talk a little bit about how they managed to pull that off?
Yeah, see, what they did is that by actually lying about the debate that took place to pass the 14th, they actually did this. They actually had a lawyer before the Supreme Court who lied about what was in the debate on the 14th Amendment. Okay? And from there, they began to go ahead and aggrandize that amendment into being something that it wasn't. Okay? In other words, they now argued that it should apply to businesses and really not the freedmen. And so I think the figures I saw on this in Goldstone's book or somewhere else is that the decisions for the 14th Amendment in regard to businesses were like in over 150 cases, from about 1876 to the turn of the century. Each one of them, because, the whole ambition of the Northeast Economic Power Center was to make corporations into the rights of human beings, the rights of people.
Right.
Okay? Therefore, it was very difficult to rule against them, no matter what they did. And so that's what they did. They slowly, over time, they began to make corporations the real intent of the 14th Amendment when it was all based upon a lie. The guy was Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling was a big business lawyer from, I think, New York, who went before the Supreme Court, and he just essentially lied his head off and said during the debate of the 14th Amendment, there was a part of the debate that wanted to apply this to businesses. And, of course, the big business back then was railroads, and he was, being paid to represent the railroads, okay? And so that's what he argued. And so the Supreme Court, which like I said earlier, was already predisposed because there were two railroad corporate lawyers on it already, and the Republicans dominated the picks of the Supreme Court. That's what they did. You cannot, in other words, if you remember, the 14th Amendment essentially says that you cannot be biased against any kind of you have to treat everybody equally. That's what it says. You cannot discriminate, okay, against anyone based upon race, okay? And so this is what they said. They said, well, see, now we want to apply this thing that you can't discriminate among businesses, okay? We want to give the same rights because it's called the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Right.
Okay, and so we want to give equal protection to businesses too. And that's why these businesses became so powerful, because it was very difficult, okay, to sue them, because they essentially had the rights of human beings, which is really kind of nutty when you think about it, okay? But that's the way that it came down. And the reason it came down that way is because of the makeup of that Supreme Court. So I hope anybody listening to this really understands that the people that get on the Supreme Court or even circuit courts, it's very, very important. It's a very important issue. It impacts history, whether we like it or not. I mean, look at Citizens United.
Right.
Okay? So whenever you hear these guys on the right talk about original intent, original intent. Well, remind them about this, okay? Where these Republican justices completely perverted the original intent of those amendments. And I'd like to know how many of those Republicans were screaming in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, okay, of this century, when the after effects of those amendments, because you have people like William F. Buckley and James Kilpatrick who are rooting them on. States' rights, states' rights. Okay, it goes all the way up to Ronald Reagan in 1980. States' rights, where he made that speech in the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, 7 miles away from where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, their dead bodies, were found after they were murdered by the Klan in cooperation with the police. Okay? So tell me what he was doing there. Yeah, great guy. All right? So the Plessy versus Ferguson case kind of unleashed a kind of mass pathology, in the South, where, as we know, everything now went. And I talked here about the torture, murder, burning of San Jose. And this was in, I think, 1899, 3 years after, in which they broke into a jail, took this black prisoner out, walked him to the center of the square. The mayor and the judges pleaded with the crowd to take him back. They walked him to the outskirts of town. They went ahead and they roped him up to a tree. They doused him in oil. They cut off one ear. Then they cut off another ear. They stripped him naked, mutilated his body, and then set him afire. And then, as his body was collapsing, they kicked him back into the flames. When he was incinerated, they cut open his body, carved out his heart, and chopped his heart up into pieces and sold it as souvenirs. Okay? That's how nutty these people were. Okay? That's how imbued with racism they were. All right? And then, of course, that led, since nobody was prosecuted for that, that led to even bigger atrocities. And I talk about here about the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, where an entire village was incinerated, and I have a picture of that one. Tulsa, Oklahoma, right. A whole section of town was set on fire, and as many as 300 African Americans were killed. And then in Ocala, Florida, 60 were killed, 330 acres were burned, and the survivors were marched to the train station and forced to leave town. Their crime, they wanted to vote. So whenever you hear somebody droning on about American exceptionalism, okay, then remind them of these Supreme Court decisions, okay, and what happened as a result of them. Because, like I said, this kind of reminds me of, the opening attacks of the Third Reich against the Jews, in Nazi Germany. All right?
Yeah.
So, now, as I said, there was a cover-up. See, these were so horrifying and so bad that there had to be a cover-up snapped on. All right? This couldn't just happen in America, but it did. All right? And that cover-up that was meant to go ahead and make American exceptionalism live was on two levels. It was on the level of popular culture and also in academia. And a lot of people fell for it, including me, including John Kennedy, okay? Because that's how thorough it was. See, in the popular culture level, there were novelists like Thomas Dixon and Claude Bowers, okay? And they, essentially, what they did is they characterized Reconstruction as the black Americans who got elected to office were a bunch of aimless bums, who were drunken idiots, okay, who bankrupted certain states and made tons of money off those states by corruption and embezzlement. And they also, of course, went ahead and tried to seduce the white women there. The Redeemers were glorified as the rescuers of Southern honor. And so that was the beginning of what we call the lost cause, the mythology of the lost cause, that somehow there was something great about Southern culture prior to 1860. Okay, and we had to go back and get it. We had to redeem it. Okay. Dixon did this with a series of 3 novels called The Leopard Spots, The Klansman, and The Traitor. And of course, Dixon was a racist. If I remember correctly, his father was part of the Klan. Here's a sentence from The Leopard Spots. Quote, "The Negro is a human donkey. You can train him, but you can't make of him a horse. What is called our race prejudice is simply God's first law of nature, the instinct of self-preservation." Unquote. See, that's what I mean. These people really believe this stuff.
And these were really popular books. These were not.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. The Klansman, the middle one in that trilogy, was made into a play, and then in 1915, the film director D.W. Griffith transformed it into an unbelievably successful movie called Birth of a Nation. By the way, Birth of a Nation, if I remember correctly about this, if you translated the price of admission back then to today, Birth of a Nation would be in the top 5. You know, that's how successful it was.
The top
that's
5
how many
grossing
people.
Movies of all time.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Right. That's how popular it was. Okay. Now, if you can believe it, I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. Woodrow Wilson screened that movie at the White House. All right. And of course, most people, well, not most, but many people have seen the film. And what the film did is it turned Reconstruction upside down. It's the white citizens who are preyed upon by these imperious black Americans. And it's the Klan who rescues those poor white people from the clutches of the freedmen, who had now, of course, descended in their natural state and ruined the South. So the Klan is made into a hero. And this is what I mean about the cover-up. Now, the other part of the cover-up was in academia, all right? Because, see, what you have to do is, to control what people are thinking, you have to get to history books and textbooks. So people like John W. Burgess, James F. Rhodes, and above all, William Dunning, began to write books that had a tremendous influence on the way college and high school textbooks were written. And of course, these guys are, Burgess once wrote, quote, "A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason and has never therefore created any civilization of any kind." That's what he said. Well, of course, if you know anything about the history of Africa, they did create 2 great empires, Songhai and Mali, okay, in Africa. All right, so Dunning became a professor, William Dunning, at Columbia, and this was his specialty. And so, if you remember what happened, their picture of the South was prominently made up of scalawags from the South who sympathized with the freedmen, the carpetbaggers who came down from the North, and these incompetent, drunken black American legislators. That's what everybody read. I mean, I remember distinctly reading about that in junior high and high school. That was my picture of what Reconstruction was about. And they combined, you too, right?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Texas, and I mean, you know, it was in the 80s, and that's what they were teaching us about, carpetbaggers and scalawags and all that stuff.
Right. And so they combined then to run their state economies into the ground. And so there's no trace in any of those renditions of the mad homicidal mass murders of the Redeemer cause. You can't find them there. All right? And so Dunning became the kind of guy who everybody followed, okay, in this whole Reconstruction rendition, even though it was completely wrong. John F. Kennedy, in Profiles in Courage, he actually kind of caricatured Thaddeus Stevens in that book. And it wasn't until 1962-63 where he began to think, boy, was I wrong. You know, he actually said that to Arthur Schlesinger and also Bobby Kennedy. You know, these Southern people really are impossible. All right?
And
now,
Deming was a Northerner. He was
Columbia, from
right,
Columbia.
teaching at Columbia.
Yeah. All right, now, this could not have gone on unless a whole series of presidents sanctioned it, okay? And unfortunately, both Democrats and Republicans looked the other way, all right? Okay, people like Woodrow Wilson, okay, people like Teddy Roosevelt, people like William Howard Taft, people like Calvin Coolidge, all right? People like Harding, people like Herbert Hoover, who actually took money from the Klan. Coolidge and Harding actually watched parades go by in front of the White House, which the Klansmen were dressed up. And I got this picture here. Coolidge actually met with a whole bunch of Confederate veterans in front of the. I mean, that's just sickening. Okay, but all these presidents looked away. You know, they did nothing in the face of all this. All right, and so the man who actually began to turn this around is somebody who almost nobody knows about. And it's a shame. It's a disgrace. Okay? Because it wasn't Martin Luther King who began the modern civil rights movement. That's simply wrong. It was a guy named Charles Hamilton Houston before King, a couple of decades before King. Charles Hamilton Houston was an officer in World War I who was greatly disappointed because he learned that even in the military, he was being discriminated against, okay, all right, as an African American. So he promised that when he returned, he was going to do something about this. So he went to Harvard, he graduated, and he decided that he had to build his own school of law and train a whole generation of lawyers to start reversing those horrible, terrible decisions the Supreme Court had made from 1876 to 1896, culminating in Plessy versus Ferguson. That was his ambition. And so he opened up this college at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he began to train a bunch of crackerjack lawyers like Oliver Miller and Thurgood Marshall. And the NAACP eventually hired him to be their lead lawyer in order to eventually knock out Plessy versus Ferguson. And so Houston managed a brilliant campaign because he knew he couldn't just, on his first case, try and knock out Plessy versus Ferguson. So he began this whole series of cases that attacked discrimination. He began in graduate schools and professional schools in the South and the border states, trying to show that black Americans were not given anywhere near the same opportunities to educate themselves and to go out and become dentists and lawyers and doctors and PhDs as white people were. And he won. I named one famous case here, Sweat versus Painter, but he won about 3 or 4 of those cases from 1936 to 1950. All right? And then that set the stage for what his great ambition was, which was to knock out Plessy versus Ferguson. But unfortunately, he died of a heart attack in 1950. And Thurgood Marshall carried on. He actually just said, you know, the highest compliment you could pay about Houston, he said, we were just carrying his bags. That's all. All right. But the thing is, those decisions, those court decisions that Charles Houston won, you know, they were ignored in the mainstream press. But at this time, you had literally dozens of newspapers in the black community, like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, etc. And they got played up in those newspapers, and they inspired other people, like Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. And they organized a demonstration in Washington during World War II in which they said, we want to do something about lynching. We want to integrate the military. And this big defense buildup that FDR is running, we want equal opportunities for black Americans. And they threatened to have a huge demonstration if Roosevelt didn't agree. And so Roosevelt agreed to go ahead and give him the last one about equal opportunities in defense plans. So they called it off. Now, Harry Truman was a little bit better in that he went ahead and he tried to get a civil rights bill passed. Okay? And I linked to the text that he used for that, but it didn't work. Okay? The legendary Southern filibuster blocked it. I guess I should explain what that is, right?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, see, once the power elite, the planter class, took over the South again by about 1890, and they blocked African Americans from voting, right? Then they completely took over almost every aspect. You know, the judiciary, the state legislatures, representatives in Congress, and the Senate. And so they could block any legislation from coming through. In Washington, they had an incredible amount of power in blocking any civil rights laws from getting through the Senate. And they did this, of course, by something called the filibuster. At that time, you had to have 67 votes to override the filibuster, because if you didn't, one of these guys from the South, okay, would get up in front of the podium, you know, and he'd start reading the phone book. And since there's no way you can stop a guy from talking, he would go on for days on end, okay? And he would only pass off to somebody who thought like he did. Mm. So these filibusters would go on for days on end, you know, and you couldn't break them, all right? And so no civil rights law went through Congress from, I believe, the late 1870s until Kennedy managed to break that streak with the civil rights bill that he put together in 1963. We'll talk about that later, of course. All right? So Truman could not get his civil rights law through, his bill through. And so Randolph said, okay, then you're going to desegregate the military then, or we're going to go ahead and call our demonstrations out. So Truman agreed to desegregate the military. And he also made some speeches against Eisenhower in 1952. All right? Now, Eisenhower, of course, was never one to stand. I mean, Eisenhower had a very bad record on civil rights for a very long, even after he left the White House and Kennedy became president. Okay? He said things, I do not believe that we can cure all the evil in men's hearts by law. That was one of his quotes. And I wrote, well, that might be true, but at least you can pass a law that will stop evil people from killing somebody, from hanging them.
Right.
Okay, you know. So his civil rights division in the White House did very little. And what makes that so bad is because in 1954, you had the Brown versus Board case. In other words, Thurgood Marshall did what his mentor, Charles Houston, had always wanted to do. Brown versus Board overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate facilities are not equal. All right? So you had this law, and Eisenhower could have upheld it, which he did not. See, the combination of the Brown decision plus the Rosa Parks King Montgomery bus boycott okay, those were like 2 atomic bombs that went off in the South. And so Eisenhower had a great opportunity to support the Brown case. He actually tried to talk Earl Warren out of siding with the defendants in that case. That's how bad Eisenhower was.
Mm.
All right. And then he also said that he actually said this to a reporter, that the Brown case set back progress in the South 15 years. And Nixon was just as bad. He said if the law goes further than public opinion can be brought along to support, it may prove to do more harm than good. Okay? So that, of course, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The law was not going to do anything unless the administration supported the law. And they had no intention of doing that. In fact, in the 6 years they were in the White House, neither one of them came out and endorsed the Brown decision. All right? So now what happens, of course, is that in 1957, the Little Rock School Board voted to integrate Central High School. In other words, they were going to abide by the Brown decision. And there were 9 African-American students chosen to be the first black Americans to go to Central High. On the day that was supposed to happen, the governor, Orville Faubus, decided to defy the school board. September 3rd, the first day of class, Faubus stationed a National Guard around the school, not to protect the students from coming in, but to keep them out. The Little Rock 9 outside. And now, the terrible part about that, of course, is that you had this ugly, unseemly, insulting crowd because they didn't want to see these students at their school. And there's a picture of it I have, in the first part of my essay.
Right.
All right? Now, what made this even worse is that Eisenhower didn't do anything for 22 days. 3 weeks. He let this go on. All right? And he didn't blame the governor. He didn't consider it Washington's business. In fact, he went on vacation to Newport, Rhode Island. All right? Now, as the spectacle dragged on, and it got more and more attention, okay, then Eisenhower had to do something. So Faubus went and visited him, and he thought he had an agreement with Faubus that he was going to pull out the National Guard. Okay, he didn't. It took a court injunction against the governor to finally pull out the National Guard on Friday, September the 20th. Now, if you can believe it, on the following Monday, with no forces there at all, the students tried to go inside, but they were assailed, jeered, spat upon by the white crowd outside. It wasn't until the 25th, that with all state authority broken down, that Eisenhower decided to send in paratroopers to control the mob. Now, as I write here, that 22-day standoff helped convince many people of either liberal persuasion or who were black Americans that the Republican Party did not have their interests at heart. If you ever needed any more convincing, that was it. Okay? I mean, as Robert Shogan of the LA Times wrote, Eisenhower was in a very strong position to do something about this problem. He had won 2 landslide elections. He had strong popularity in almost all parts of the country. He could have assured everyone that this move towards reconciliation was in their interest. Because at that time, ideas about the issue were in an emerging, moldable form at that time, in the 50s. So what did he decide to do? Not very much. Even after Little Rock, by the way, Herbert Brownell, his Attorney General, sent a bill to Congress creating something called the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. This was a 6-person panel furnished with a chief counsel They were supposed to submit a report on racial findings to the White House. In its final form, it was as much Lyndon Johnson's act as it was Eisenhower's, because Johnson realized that he was never going to get this through the filibustering Southern Bloc in the South. All right, but he looked at this as an opportunity to make himself more palatable to Northern and Western liberals if he decided to run in 1960. Okay, in its final form, the bill was kind of defanged of its strongest aspects in order to make it through the Senate so it wouldn't be filibustered. See, this made it through, but it didn't really, because Johnson made a deal with the leaders of the Southern filibustering group, and that was Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and Richard Russell of Georgia. Okay? And the agreement was, I'll defang the bill, I'll pull out its strongest aspects, and we'll just leave it with this Civil Rights Commission. Okay? And it's not going to be very enforceable anyway. Okay, so in agreement with that, will you guys not filibuster? Well, they agreed to do it, but they double-crossed them because Strom Thurmond did do a filibuster. And I think that was to remind Johnson, don't ever try this again, buddy. Okay? All right? Now, as Harris Woolford, who was one of the assistants on that U.S. Civil Rights Commission, later wrote, Eisenhower hardly supported them at all. Okay? Almost nothing at all. Was very surprised at that. All right? Now, because of the Brown decision, the South is they're getting crazy, because they know that this thing gets enforced, it's the end of what they had in the South. So now there began to be bombings and assaults all over the South. The Klan has new life. Okay, and a lot of people kind of figured that what Eisenhower and Nixon were doing was essentially leaving this problem. They didn't want to deal with it to whoever came after them. Mm-hmm. All right, which of course we know is going to be JFK. So in other words, from 1876, the triumph of the Redeemer cause, to 1960, okay, that's a period of 84 years. You had Roosevelt issuing a fair employment order for the defense industry, Truman integrating the military. You had Eisenhower, after 3 weeks of nothing but harassment, finally sending in troops to Little Rock. And then Eisenhower and LBJ created the Civil Rights Commission with little enforcement power. That's all that was done. That's all that was done in nearly a century to reverse what had happened in the South. All those horrible atrocities and murders and hangings and lynchings, and the burning up of whole cities and towns. Okay, that's all you have. Okay? And so it was left then to John F. Kennedy, simply because nobody else wanted to do anything about it.
This is Our Hidden History